Welcome everyone. Thanks so much for joining us virtually this afternoon. I hear there are hundreds of you registered for this talk from all over the world, which is really exciting for us at the museum. My name is Imma Ramos and I'm the curator of the British Museum's current exhibition, Tantra, Enlightenment to Revolution. As part of the show's public programme, we're delighted to be joined by Dr. James Mallinson, whose pioneering research has radically altered our knowledge of yoga's history. Dr. Mallinson is reader in Indology and Yoga Studies at SOAS, and his research focuses on the history and current traditional practices of yoga. He has published many books, all of which are editions and translations of Sanskrit yoga texts, epic tales, and poetry. One of his most recent is the Penguin classic Roots of Yoga, written in collaboration with Mark Singleton. Dr. Mallinson recently led the Hatha Yoga Project, a 5-year research project on the history of physical yoga funded by the European Research Council. In his presentation today, he'll be introducing us to Hatha Yoga and its links to Tantra in light of the completion of this project. Dr. Mallinson, over to you.
Thank you very much, Imma. Can everyone hear me okay? You can hear me okay? I'm on? Great. Yes, so I'm going to talk specifically about my, the focus of my research, which, as Dr. Ramos said, is Hatha Yoga. Now, I have a sort of general definition of Hatha Yoga, which I think will hopefully come up on a slide. Yeah, I can see the slide there. Hang on, I just need to pin this. Oh, that's better. Okay. So yes, Hatha Yoga is yoga in which physical methods predominate. Now, as Dr. Ramos pointed out, I have been I've been leading a research project for the last 5 years, researching the history of Hatha Yoga. There's been a team of, it's varied in number, but sort of usually about 6 of us have been working using textual, ethnographic and art historical methods to trace the development of physical yoga practice. And at the beginning of the project, I've been working on Hatha Yoga since my PhD, which I started in 1995. At the beginning of the project, I rather thought that the practices, so the physical practices of yoga, were ancient, but that they were first written down about 1,000 years ago, because that's when our earliest texts on Hatha Yoga appear. But actually, since nearing the end of the project, I've sort of realized that in fact, there is actually no evidence for any of these practices prior to about 1,000 years ago, and that they're an innovation on the Indian religious scene, or an innovation everywhere. Excuse me. And prior to about 1,000 years ago, the only, sorry, I'm just trying to click on, there we go, perfect, we've got a very clever system here. The only physical practices that were associated with yoga in India were those of asceticism, which is usually called tapas in Sanskrit. So you see here this picture, which is an illustration to a manuscript of the Ramayana in the British Library. You see these various depictions of the sage Vishwamitra performing tapas, and you'll see him sort of hanging upside down or keeping his arms in the air for long periods, standing up on one leg and so forth. So up to 1,000 years ago, the physical methods that we used were for mortifying the body. The body was something to be subdued, sort of controlled or even ignored, to be overcome. And it's only with the arrival of the text on Hatha Yoga, and we have some material evidence as well from relatively early, but not quite as early as the text, and I'll have a look at that in a bit. But it's only then that we see this sort of new attitude towards the body, in which it's something to be cultivated, something to be used in order to produce yogic, elevated yogic states of mind. So it's that I've been working on. Why this happened, I'm not completely, I have no good answer to that. There does seem to be some influence from Chinese traditions of inner alchemy, which slightly predate the texts that we work on. But they only really, the parallels are really only in the framework, in the principles of the practice, rather than the practices themselves. Okay, so the innovations, they take the form of, if you see in this slide, four things really. First of all, complex balancing asanas or postures. Okay, so as I pointed out before this period, before about 1,000 years ago, the only postures that ascetics were doing in India were things that they would do for years on end, you know, or days or months on end. Whereas about 1,000 years ago, we see the appearance of postures and techniques that can't be held indefinitely, balancing postures, for example. And I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. Now, also, I should add, of course, that Hatha Yoga is the, you know, it basically forms the basis of much of the physical yoga practiced around the world today. But there are lots of features that we see today that we might even think are very typical of yoga practice that we don't find in our earlier sources. So, you know, one of the things we've been looking into in the project is exactly that. You know, what do we see in modern yoga practice that we don't see in our pre-modern historical sources? And we don't find, which has been quite a surprise, we don't find any sequences. There's one relatively late text, which I and my colleagues are in some disagreement with, which may suggest sequences, but certainly nothing like the sort of complex sequences we might associate with today's Ashtanga Yoga or Surya Namaskara, the sun salutation. And also we don't find any standing poses whatsoever. So even though there's a change from these kind of practices of mortification, of tapas, to things that are more for cultivating the body, we don't find these sort of the dynamic methods that we might associate with yoga today. Together with these complex postures, we find complex breathing methods. Prior to about 1,000 years ago, the only breathing methods we find in yoga texts is a relatively simple alternate nostril breathing and then holding the breath for long periods. And again, actually, that is associated with mortifying the body. It's seen as something tough and difficult and painful. You know, the Buddha says he tries it, for example, and he says he holds his breath for as long as is physically possible and his stomach's burning up, but he says he doesn't get anywhere. So it's about 1,000 years ago that these new methods of complex inhalation and exhalation appear. And then thirdly, dynamic methods of manipulating the vital energies. Okay, so a lot of the practices, in fact, the key central practices of Hatha Yoga are directed towards manipulating the breath or other sort of manifestations of the vital energy, whether that be Kundalini, I'll talk a bit more about that, the serpent goddess at the base of the central channel, or Bindu and Raja, so these are the kind of sexual essences in men and women. The practices are aimed at preserving them and raising them up the central channel. And then finally, just, I won't go into much detail on this, but also the cleansing techniques. So, you know, methods of sort of auto-enema, and there's called basti, and then dhauti, where you swallow a long cloth and then pull it out again in order to cleanse your intestines. These two don't appear in our textual record until, well, actually those final ones, the cleansing techniques, don't appear until this text. I've got a quote from it below, the Hatha Pradipika, sometimes called the Hatha Yoga Pradipika, but in manuscripts we only ever see it called the Hatha Pradipika, and which means something like the light on Hatha. In fact, I've just got about to start a project editing that text, which is very exciting. And it's in that text that we get this definition of the practice of Hatha, which I've put here, which corresponds, you know, to these new practices. So the sequence of Hatha is identified with posture, asana, various methods of breath control, which here are known as kumbhaka, which is also the word for restraining the breath, holding the breath, and then the techniques called mudra, to which are added a meditative practice of concentration on nada, i.e. the internal sounds that appear during meditation and breath control and so forth. Now, what I'm obviously in the context of this wonderful exhibition, so I forgot to thank Dr. Ramos at the beginning. I'm very so delighted to be involved with the exhibition and also to be invited to talk today. The purpose of the talk here is to look at the relationship between Hatha Yoga and Tantra. Now, as I pointed out, the key techniques of Hatha Yoga are innovations. Okay, we don't see them, and I was, this has been a big surprise to me when I started my doctoral studies. It was on a technique called Khetri Mudra. I'll talk a bit more about that later, but I was almost certain that I would find evidence for these practices within Tantric texts, because at the time that Hatha Yoga appears, about 1,000 years ago, Tantra broadly conceived, and then more specifically Shaiva Tantra, so Tantra in which the deity Shiva, or sometimes his partner Shakti, the goddess, is the primary deity. That really was kind of the dominant religious tradition of India. My supervisor from Oxford, Professor Alexis Sanderson, he's defined the period from 500 to 1200 CE as the Shaiva age. Okay, so I mean, it's really no surprise that anything that should appear 1,000 years ago is going to be couched, is going to be framed in the vocabulary and the terminology and the teachings of Tantra. And sure enough, that is, of course, the case with Hatha Yoga. And when I was putting this talk together, I thought, well, I'll look at the different strands that derive from Tantric traditions and come to form the Hatha Yoga, specifically of the text I mentioned earlier, the Hatha Pradipika, because that text is, for the most part, a compilation. Okay, it's the author Imma Ramos, he draws together practice traditions from different streams of, for the most part, Tantric, well, exclusively Tantric traditions. And then I've listed them, as you can see here, and I'm going to look at these 4 different streams: Vajrayana, i.e. Tantric Buddhism; Shaiva, Tantra in which Shiva is the main deity; Vaishnava, Tantra in which Vishnu is the main deity; and then Jaina tradition, so the from the Jain religion. And then I was looking back at this earlier, and I thought, well, actually, that's pretty much all of Indian religion at this time. So every single stream, every single tradition of Indian religious practice at this time does contribute in some way towards Hatha Yoga. So what I'm going to do now is look at these different streams individually, first of all starting off with Vajrayana Buddhist Tantra. Now this has been one of the big surprises for me as part of, well, there have been many exciting surprises. That's always a good thing in research, I think, to find out new things. That's the whole point of it. But it's really taken me down some avenues, some paths that were quite unexpected, is the importance of Vajrayana or Buddhist traditions in the early history of Hatha Yoga. Not least its name, because the term Hatha Yoga first appears in Buddhist Tantric texts. And I've got a rather daunting long list here. You don't need to, I'm not going to go through all of these in turn, but digging around with the help of lots of colleagues. I'm no expert in Tantric Buddhism, but various colleagues have helped me out here. And it started off by my colleague Jason Birch, but then others have contributed. And I've identified usages of the term Hatha Yoga in 17 Tantric Buddhist texts. Okay, so that's not a huge amount considering there are thousands of these texts. But at the same time, what is significant is we don't find it used in any other text at all. So, I'd always assumed, along with all other scholars, I think, pretty much of Hatha Yoga, that it derived from Shaiva Tantra. But it's pretty clear, I'm now convinced, that the name itself comes from these Tantric Buddhist traditions. And I've got the sort of, it's pretty obscure, even within these, and many of these texts themselves are very obscure and hard to understand, even for the initiates. But the best definition within any of these texts, oh, hang on, there we go, is in a text called the Vimala Prabha, which is Pundarika's commentary on the Kala Chakra Tantra. So that's written around the middle of the 11th century. And here, in these Tantric Buddhist traditions, Hatha Yoga is closely associated, well, it is a part of Tantric sexual ritual. And something that people fail, popular understandings of Tantra and sexual ritual in Tantra always seem sort of popularized by Sting and so forth, as this idea that, involves sexual intercourse for hours on end without ejaculation. But in fact, that's not really the case, particularly in Shaiva traditions and also in mainstream, if we can call it that, mainstream Tantric Buddhist traditions. The sexual ritual does result in orgasm, and so in Shaiva traditions, the fluids that are produced are offered to various deities and so forth. But within Tantric Buddhism, there's a kind of radical, unorthodox teaching that's called Hatha Yoga, and you'll see it here. Where do we see? So during sexual ritual, Hatha Yoga is if one forcefully makes the breath flow in the central channel through the practice of nada, we won't worry about that, to attain the undying moment, which is the kind of goal of the practice, by non-vibration through restraining the drops of bodhicitta, i.e. semen, in the penis when it is in the vagina. So Hatha yoga is sexual ritual in which ejaculation does not occur. Okay, and it's seen as a sort of fringe practice. In fact, most people condemn it, even within the Tantric Buddhist traditions. Okay, so there was that. That's the surprise, as I mentioned, that Hatha yoga, the term itself, derives from Tantric Buddhism. And then in this project I've been working on, part of the sort of core of it is editing 10 Sanskrit texts on yoga practice, on Hatha yoga practice. And the earliest of those is a text called the Amrita Siddhi. And you'll see in front of you here is the oldest known manuscript of that text, which we only got hold of just at the beginning of the project. And in fact, I'd been working on the text for a few years before that from much later manuscripts. And reading this with various colleagues, in particular Dr. Peter Daniel Santo in Oxford a few years ago, reading this particular manuscript, it became clear that the Amrita Siddhi also was composed within a Tantric Buddhist milieu. Before that, not many scholars had worked on it. Professor Curtis Schaefer in the University of Virginia, he'd worked on it, but he'd sort of rather assumed it was from a Shaiva tradition, but I think we can confidently pin it down to a Tantric Buddhist tradition. So that again was a big surprise, and has sent me down various fascinating avenues trying to work out how this may have happened and how it then changed from being a Tantric Buddhist tradition to a Tantric Shaiva tradition, the teachings within the Amrita Siddhi. Now the text itself, one of the things, yes, that confirms that it's written within a Tantric Buddhist milieu is that at its beginning, its opening Mangala verse. So Sanskrit texts generally open with a sort of auspicious verse of praise. It invokes the goddess Chinnamasta, she whose head is cut off. And prior, even though she's now widely recognized to be one of the 10 Mahavidya goddesses, very popular in Bengal, and which we see in the exhibition at the British Museum. But prior to the 14th or 15th century, she is only found within Tantric Buddhist traditions. Okay, so that was a kind of a dead giveaway. But the Mangala verse invoking her was not found in the later manuscripts. It's only found in the earlier ones. So we can there see that that's more evidence that the text comes from this Tantric Buddhist milieu. Now, as for the practices themselves, this is what I'm going to turn to now as I go through the remaining traditions. They are they're couched in a sort of metaphor, in a vocabulary of inner alchemy. The body is likened to a sort of crucible, but the key teachings are these 3 physical practices called, here we've got Mahamudra, and this is an illustration from a much later manuscript, from this 18th century 18th or 19th century manuscript in the British Library, which is shown in the exhibition at the British Museum. So we have this Mahamudra, where you sort of inhale, fill the body up, and then the Mahabandha, where you apply these 2 locks at the bottom and top of the central column to lock the air in, like it's in a sort of alchemical crucible. And then the third technique, which is only really clear what you do in this third technique, the Mahaveda, in the Amrita Siddhi, because in subsequent traditions it's lost. Okay, in subsequent Sanskrit texts on Hatha yoga, well, it's not lost, but it changes and it's not quite the same. And it seems that they didn't really understand what was going on in the Amrita Siddhi. But now I've got a little bit of footage here. That manuscript that I showed you of the text, you may have noticed that it was written in different alphabets, and 2 of them, in fact, were Tibetan, because this text, the Amrita Siddhi, and its practices traveled to Tibet pretty early on in its existence, along with lots of Tantric Buddhism, and seem to have survived there. The teachings have survived there, whereas the sort of specifics of it don't seem to have survived in India. So I've got this little bit of footage of this is from Dr. Ian Baker's show at the Wellcome Institute a few years ago called Tibet's Secret Temple, and he invited this Tibetan yogi, to demonstrate the technique there. And going back to what's done is the body is filled up with air and then it's sealed, and then the idea is that you bang the base of the central column in order to force the breath to sort of erupt upwards and go up to the head, thereby taking the vital energy, in particular bindu or semen as it's understood in this text, up to the cranial aperture So hopefully if I click here, you'll see this yogi. I'm afraid I don't know his name. He's doing this rather dynamic practice there, the bangs, he bangs down, and that motion is said to, and I was very lucky to travel with Dr. Baker to Bhutan a couple of years ago and met some, well, one yogi in particular there, and I discussed with him the teachings in the Amrita Siddhi, and he said, yes, that's exactly what we do. You know, that's why we do these practices called BEPs, I think they're called. My Tibetan is almost non-existent, but yeah, so the practices do seem to survive there in Tibetan forms of Tantric Buddhism. Okay, so that's the Amrita Siddhi and Vajrayana. Yeah, so the Amrita Siddhi, its techniques seem to, a lot of the principles, the framework of Hatha Yoga practice are first introduced in that text, and then they are found in a lot of subsequent texts. Now, within Shaiva Tantra, so within what I'm going to look at now are the early Hatha Yoga texts that derive from Shaiva Tantric traditions, or are from, you know, they are, one can call them Tantric traditions because they, you know, they have all the hallmarks of Tantra. They introduce more practices. Some of them overlap with what we see in the Amrita Siddhi. So here we have the Mula Bandha Mudra, which again is the sealing the base of the central channel. This one is Uddiyana, where it's quite hard for artists to depict this one, but the abdomen is being drawn in. And then thirdly, the Jalandhara Bandha. So this is actually quite close to what we see as Mahabandha in the Amrita Siddhi, where you seal the top of the central channel. But again, the idea is that by using these techniques and others, which I'll come on to, you can raise the breath, raise the vital energy, or, as we'll see in a second, Kundalini, up the central channel. All these different traditions, even if they frame their teachings in different metaphors and so forth, it's all about making some kind of vital energy rise up the central channel of the body. Another practice is the Viparita. Well, here it's called Vipariti Mudra in this British Library manuscript. It's normally known as Viparita Karani or Karana, which basically means the reverser, the inverter. So here it's a kind of, to some extent, a sort of crude method of keeping the vital energies in the head rather than letting them you know, dissipate downwards. So you invert the body. It's also associated in what is an interesting discovery we've had in one of the texts we've been working on called the Viveka Martanda, where this practice is directly associated with the yogic method of pratyahara, the yogic technique of drawing your senses inwards, so kind of sealing yourself off from the outside world. And this is said to be a very effective way of doing that. Then there's Khechari Mudra, okay, which is the practice actually I did my PhD on, where the tongue is turned backwards and up above the soft palate in order to, there are two sort of purposes to it, either to stop the amrita, the nectar of immortality, which is often equated with bindu or semen, from dropping down. Similar, you know, similar as we saw with the Viparita technique of trying to keep these vital energies in the head. Or it's also associated with raising Kundalini. And I don't know if you can see here in this illustration, we've got the chakras, the 6 chakras, and then I think, I can't, my screen's a bit small here, but I think that you can see the snake form of the goddess Kundalini at the top of the head. And this Kundalini and the chakras is very much a contribution to Hatha Yoga that comes from Shaiva Tantra. Okay, and I've got a couple more images. We've got this image which is found in the exhibition of a yogi from Kangra in Himachal Pradesh, probably 18th century, with the 6 or 7 chakras, 6 plus 1 chakras lined along the central column. And here's another one from Jodhpur, illustrated manuscript of the Siddha Siddhanta Padhati. And then just finally on the chakras, there's I think it's interesting to note here that within Tantric traditions, the chakra, you know, prior to Hatha Yoga, in which the chakras do gradually become a bit more kind of physical, a bit more corporeal, and, you know, physical techniques work on them. But when they originate, they're much more things that you visualize. And I think this scroll from Nepal rather illustrates that, the fact that lots of the chakras are outside of the body, so they're clearly not part of the body, but you use your you visualize in the process of tantric meditation the chakras along this central column, which may extend beyond the body. What we don't see, I mean, apart from that inverted posture, within the early Shaiva Hatha Yoga texts, we really don't see anything on asana or posture at all. But another really exciting discovery that we made during the course of this project was quite near the beginning, 2016. My colleague Dr. Daniela Bevlakra and I visited this gate in Gujarat called the Mahudi Gate. It's part of a sort of set of fortifications around the outside of this city. It's very near Baroda. And we'd gone there, just it was on our way somewhere else, and I'd read an old Hindi article from the 50s talking about the images of Nath yogis, so this very important lineage of yoga practitioners. And it pointed out that there were 12 sculptures of them, and you can see there's these three registers of sculptures on the inside of the gate, and round the bottom, this is just a sort of a court, you're seeing half of one side. Round the bottom were 12 of these Nath yogis. So we thought, well, let's go and have a look. That sounds interesting. And sure enough, there's these great representations, although the ones lower down have been badly destroyed, as you can see. So here is Matsyendra, who's thought to be or is recognized as the first human guru of the Nath lineage. And there's Goraksha, the second. So there's those two. But then what had never been reported by any scholars at all before were the next two layers. And we can see really the strong tantric connections here with this yoga tradition, because the next layer, there are 8 yoginis. Here's the bird-headed yogini Pingala. I'm only showing a couple from each register. Here's another yogini holding a severed head. I'm not sure exactly who she is. I haven't actually been able to match this to a textual tradition, the iconography on the gate. And then I think even more amazingly, I think these are rather wonderful. The next layer up are there are 8 Bhairavas with consorts. Now I've been back to this place 2 or 3 times, but still yet to write it up properly, and it really merits a detailed study. I've got 2 or 3 of these Bhairavas, I think. Rather wonderful. We can date it, as I said, as I put in the caption, to almost exactly to 1230. Okay, but then, relevant to what I'm talking about today, about Hatha Yoga, my colleague Dr. Bevlakra, as we were looking around, she noticed up in the eaves at the top here, there are 84 depictions of yogis, some of whom are doing asanas, are doing complex postures. I can show you a few here. And these are by about 300 years are the oldest known depictions of asana practice. Okay, complex postures, things other than tapas, those practices of mortification or seated positions for meditation. 2 or 3 of those here. It's an inverted lotus posture. And a headstand there as well. So we can see here, clearly, because this is clearly a tantric tradition, we've got these Nath yogis, and then the yoginis, and then Bhairava, these fearsome-looking Bhairavas with consorts, and then all these yogis, some of whom are doing yoga postures. Okay, now moving on. What's the time? I think I should be all right. I'm probably have to speed up a little bit. I'm going to try and keep to 35 minutes. Vaishnava Tantra, so Tantra in which Vishnu is the predominant deity. Now, here, the main contribution, this is something I stumbled across some years ago, probably 10 years ago now, is that actually the earliest known descriptions of these non-seated, these complex yoga postures are found in tantric texts from Vaishnava traditions. First of all, the earliest known one is this text called the Vimarnarchana Kalpa, which is probably 10th, maybe 11th century. The date's quite hard to fix, but pretty early. And that teaches, kind of out of the blue, and it doesn't give any explanation at all, it teaches 9 postures, one of which is the peacock posture here. You'll see, okay. And then, I won't bother reading the description, but you can see how it's practiced. And then a little bit after that, the Ahirbudnya Samhita, which I think is normally dated to about the 12th century, which is a slightly different Vaishnava tradition. The previous one is from kind of more ascetic, temple ritual-based tradition called the Vaikhanasas. This one is a Pancharatrika text, the Ahirbudnya Samhita. And here we see it's the first text to introduce Kukutasana, this balancing posture, where you put your hands through your legs whilst in the lotus position. And again, the clear difference between these and what goes before is that you can't hold these postures indefinitely. I guess probably a few minutes is the maximum anyone could do something like this. Or someone will probably correct me there. It's probably some world record. Okay, so that's that's a significant contribution from the Vaishnava tantric traditions. And then finally, Jain Tantra, which I think in itself is a somewhat controversial term, because some Jain traditions don't reject Tantra, as we can say with some, very orthodox mainstream Hindu traditions as well. But the Jain polymath, amazing scholar Hemachandra, who wrote a yoga shastra in the 12th century, and on that he wrote what he calls the Swapagya Vritti, so his own auto commentary on it. And in that there are various postures, and that includes a couple of headstand type things. As you can see here, the Duryodhana pose, which is like a regular headstand, and then this Danda Padmasana, which is an inverted lotus posture. And it may be because Hemachandra actually, he flourished, he was in a town in Gujarat called Patan, not that far from Dabhoi. And maybe it's not insignificant, because we saw, in Dabhoi where that gate was, we got these two postures are on that gate. And in fact, the gate, even though it's very much Shaiva iconography, the patrons of the gate were two Jain merchants called, they're called Tejapal and Vastupal. So maybe there's some connection there that merits more investigation. Okay, so that's a kind of survey of the contributions of the different strands of Tantra into physical yoga practice, into Hatha yoga. Now, one of the big differences between these traditions and yoga as understood today is that really these texts, they're all, and the practices themselves, the theory behind them, they're geared purely for celibate male ascetics. Okay, and we see this kind of explained really in the Amrita Siddhi, going back to that first text I was talking about, the Tantric Buddhist one, in which this text is seen as a sort of, it can be understood as a reaction against Tantric Buddhist sexual ritual traditions. And it's saying, so you've got the Hatha yoga that I mentioned before, in which they're rejecting orgasm or ejaculation. But then the Amrita Siddhi goes a step further, and it's rejecting sexual practice and says that the yogi should do all this within his own body. And what it's saying here in these verses here is that the purpose of the yoga taught within the text is to overcome the impulse for ejaculation, okay, and then reverse the downward flow of semen within the body. And you see in verse 2, when that breath, i.e. the breath that expels the bindu out of the body, has been conquered, it overcomes the bliss that is death by time, okay, because the idea is that by having an orgasm, you shed your vital energy, and then that results in kala, which is both time and death. And then it says that the innate bliss, sahajananda, which is the ultimate goal of the sexual ritual in Tantric Buddhism, that bliss arises just with, so basically saying you don't need to engage in sexual ritual. If you master these yoga practices, you can get all those benefits just within your own body. And not only that, I think one of the questions I've long been asking myself is why, the context of production of these texts. Why do we suddenly get all these texts appearing from about 1,000 years ago teaching these physical yoga methods? And I think my best guess now, and it makes good sense to me, is that it's because this is the period, not only do these practices appear, but also it's during this period that we get a real flourishing of monasteries, okay, monastic institutions throughout India. And I just got a couple of 4 or 5 pictures here. This one in particular is of interest, and I'm going to come back to it briefly. In Karnataka is probably where the region where the Amrita Siddhi was composed, or nearby, and this is a Nath monastery, which we know has been there for at least 1,000 years. And I just got a couple of others. But it seems likely that what was going on was that these monasteries functioned a bit like universities. Okay, they were producing their own texts, and all of them wanted to sort of stake a claim for their own individual traditions to this new this new innovation that was the practice of physical yoga. So they all produce their own texts, and they're kind of, you can see they're all borrowing from one another as well. That's part of our texture work, is seeing who's borrowing what from where and so forth, and we can trace the development of the text in that way. But yeah, this is just showing you some of the monasteries from that period. I'm aware I'm going slightly over time, but I should only be a couple more minutes. Yeah, Sringeri, Karnataka. I mean, this actually, the temple here is probably as late as 1500, but it's quite likely that, you know, an important Hatha Yoga text, the Shiva Samhita, was composed there, for example. Okay, now finally, I'm just going to look at the concepts of the Raja Yoga and the Raja Yogi. So any of you who are familiar, well, a lot of people will have heard the term Raja Yoga, but those who aren't, you know, haven't looked into the history from the text, rather should probably dispel what your understanding, because it's quite different. Well, what we find within Sanskrit textual traditions on Raja Yoga is quite different from, you know, the kind of 20th century understanding of it as just purely meditative practice, although it's related. But I think just to sort of, you know, there's this big contrast, this big disconnect between what I've been talking to you about and yoga today, and that it was purely the preserve of celibate male yogis. But within these monastic traditions, there's this institution of the Raja Yogi, okay, so the head of the monastery, in many traditions is known as the king, and in some specifically as the Raja Yogi, okay. And he would not, you know, often would not be a celibate yogi. You know, he would not be an ash-clad guy in a loincloth living in caves and so forth. They would function like kings. You know, they were incredibly powerful. They would build stuff, you know, make tanks for water, and they would rule effectively like kings. They were extremely powerful. And then, and so within the texts themselves, they're teaching Hatha Yoga, but they also often teach Raja Yoga as well. And I actually, sorry, just move on to the next slide. I've got a nice description from Kadri, that the first monastery I showed you a picture of. The king of the yogis in this is from an Italian traveller in 1506. It's quite different from, you know, our understanding of ascetics. And he is what does it say, a man of great dignity, has about 30,000 people, is a pagan, of course, that's what Vartema would say. So, you know, he goes on pilgrimage once in every 3 or 4 years, like a pilgrim, with 3,000 or 4,000 of his people and with his wife and children. See, this is quite significant. And he takes 4 or 5 coursers and civet cats, apes, parrots, leopards, and falcons. And in this way, he goes through the whole of India. So this is, and to this day in Kadri, so I was very lucky to go in 2016. There's a ceremony which happens every 12 years where the Nath yogi tradition still has this institution of the Raja Yogi, the king yogi, and he is installed, this is his consecration, his abhisheka, every 12 years. So I got to visit this then, and you'll see it's still a big deal. And so this notion of the king, of the yogi as king, the yogi in the world, okay, rather than a renouncer, is there. And the idea of Raja Yoga seems to go along with that, in that it echoes an earlier tantric conception of the Rajabhisheka, where kings would get a special tantric initiation, which would allow them not to have to do all the complex, difficult rituals all the time, because they had to fulfill their kingly duties. Okay, and similarly, Raja Yoga is taught within the text as a very difficult method of practice, but very simple at the same time. So only the best yogis can do it. But actually, if you can do it, it's not super demanding. Oh, sorry, one more slide on this vein as well. So Yogi Adityanath, jumping back to the present day, who is the head of the Nath tradition now up in UP, and he's also the chief minister of Uttar Pradesh. But what I think is significant here is that here's a recent biography of him in which he's called the Raja Yogi. So there's still this idea, it's still current within Indian vernacular languages, the idea of the Raja Yogi, the yogi as king. But I think that kind of, my point here is that this is like the chink, it's the thin end of the wedge that actually allows, because we find within the text that it's through this notion of Raja Yoga that anyone can do yoga. Okay, you don't have to be a celibate ascetic. And we find these ideas appearing. I've got a couple more slides, just a couple of quotes from two texts. So from the Dattatreya Yoga Shastra, which is a text we've been working on, and the final practice it teaches is called Vajroli Mudra, which I think actually derives from Tantric Buddhism, and it's a practice in sexual ritual which enables the yogi not to ejaculate. So I think actually it was probably, the secret technique of Hatha yoga as taught in early Tantric Buddhism. But it says at the end of the teaching of Vajrayogini Mudra that the yogi who has attained Raja Yoga may do whatever he wants. Okay, so after obtaining the excellent Raja Yoga, which subjects all beings to his will, so the idea is that he's a ruler, he's in control of everything. The yogi can do anything or nothing, behaving as he likes. Okay, and he also gets bhukti and mukti, which is enjoyment, worldly pleasures and liberation. As opposed to more ascetic kind of Hatha yoga traditions, which are generally focused on liberation, mukti alone. The Raja yoga allows for the attainment of bhukti, of worldly enjoyment. And then this is nicely put in another of the texts that we've been working on in the project. Jason Birch is editing. It's the final slide I've got, describing the king among yogis, the yogi rat, sometimes naked in caves, sometimes wearing divine clothes, sometimes a loincloth, sometimes enjoying lovemaking with a divine woman, sometimes celibate, sometimes living off alms, sometimes indulging himself. The king among yogis has no restrictions whatsoever and leaves troubles behind. Okay, so this is, my contention is that it's through this sort of reinvention of the Tantric Rajabhisheka in the form of Raja Yoga, and the idea that the master yogi can cast off all the restrictions of Hatha Yoga and live in the world, enjoying themselves in whatever way they may like, which I think takes us nicely back to the Tantric traditions. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Oh no,
Mallinson.
I got it wrong, didn't I? I've not been pressing the slides at all. Oh no. Gosh, Imma, someone should have called me.
Oh no, that's all right.
Good idea. Let me do a quick recap. Sorry,
yes, all right.
Gosh, I clicked on the wrong thing on my screen. Oh dear, that's terrible. Where did I get to? Kadri Mata. Let me just quickly flick through these. This is the Abhisheka of the yogi, and my sound has gone off. Maybe someone was shouting 100%. At me. Gosh, I do apologize. But this is the Abhisheka of the yogi, of the Raja yogi. And then here's what I was saying about Yogi Adityanath. God, I do apologize. And this is his biography, the Raja, where he's called a Raja yogi. I didn't miss too much. There's just the final two slides here. You'll see this is the Amaraga Prabodha. So the idea is that the master yogi, as I said, can do whatever he wants, reverting to Tantric traditions. Sorry about that. I clicked on the wrong button on my screen, but I think you got the point anyway. I'll finish there.
Yes, that's great. Thanks so much, Dr. Mallinson, for that. That was a fascinating talk. And we've had lots of questions coming in. My colleague is gathering those together, but and we're going to have time for questions for Dr. Mallinson. And first of all, I thought I would ask you some initial questions. I'd really like to hear, and I'm sure other people will want to hear also about your personal journey. So how you became interested in the study of yoga.
Okay, well, it's a long story, and I will try because I've already spoken for too long, and I'm really sorry about it. I'm glad it was only a few slides at the end because a long story. But I actually first went to India when I was 17 in a gap year between school and university. I already decided to read Sanskrit. I was already accepted to Oxford to read Sanskrit. And at the end of that first trip, I fell in with a bunch of quite sort of roguish yogis in Kashmir who were on the pilgrimage up to Amarnath. And that kind of set me off. I was fascinated. And I've been back to India every year since, basically. But I would more and more spending time with traditional ascetics and yogis, traveling ascetics. And at the same time, I was continuing my academic studies. I did an MA at SOAS and my major there was anthropology, so looking at ascetic traditions in India through anthropology. But I decided at the end of that that I didn't want to continue with anthropology. I wanted to go back to using the Sanskrit that I'd studied as an undergraduate. And so I applied to Oxford to do a PhD, but I needed to find a text to edit. And there was an amazing sort of circle of scholars around Professor Alexis Sanderson in Oxford at the time. And all of them were working on editing texts, primarily Tantric texts. I was the only one wanting to look at the stuff that I was interested in. But I needed to find a text that was relevant to this world of traveling, itinerant ascetics and yogis that I was fascinated in India. And the only Sanskrit texts that were of any relevance were the ones on Hatha Yoga. So I plumped for this text called the Khetri Vidya, which is about Khetri Mudra, the practice I was talking about earlier. And I edited that. It was a rather bigger job than I'd anticipated. When I started, I thought there were only 7 manuscripts. I ended up with 30. But at the end of that, I mean, that just kind of threw up more questions than I'd answered, than it had answered about the bigger context, the bigger history of the yogic tradition. So since then I've continued going back and forth from India. It's, the two things have kind of fed one another. The lived tradition that I've been part of in India, and also my academic studies, have definitely fed off one another. But I think, yeah, it was kind of somewhat by accident. It wasn't by design that I wasn't obsessed purely with yoga. I was obsessed with the whole yoga tradition. And with hindsight, I was very lucky to get into it then. I started my PhD in 1995, at which point yoga was still quite a fringe activity. Okay, so slightly ahead of the curve of yoga studies. No one had done any serious editorial work on any of the texts on Hatha Yoga. So yeah, I'm lucky to have got in there when I did, and as a result, because of yoga becoming so popular, there's a lot of interest in my work.
Fantastic. And so what about now? Can you tell us more about the SOAS project, so the discoveries and the outputs that we can expect to see more of?
Okay, well, as I said during the talk, the core of the project is critical edition, so of 10 key important texts on Hatha Yoga. So critical edition is when you gather all the manuscripts you can of a text, you compare them, and you work out what you think, an important, if possible, usually not possible, the earliest version of the text might be, and then translate that and comment on that and so forth. So we've got 10 of those, starting with the Amrita Siddhi that I mentioned, going right up to a probably 18th century text called the Hatha Paddhati, which means the manual of yoga practice. So those will all be outputs, those editions and translations. Also, there's been a great kind of part of the project making a film about the techniques in the Hatha Paddhati, the latest of the 10 texts, because that teaches 112 postures, some of which are dynamic. And so a film has been made of that, which should be ready quite soon. Lots of articles, of course. I've published quite a few articles. Particularly, I've been looking into the Buddhist lineages of Hatha Yoga, and then 4 monographs as well. So I am writing. I've got sort of bits of it done. Obviously, there's lots more to be done. But a monograph on the early history of Hatha Yoga. My colleague, Dr. Bevalakwa, she's an anthropologist, so she spent 2 or 3 years of the project in India, living with traditional practitioners of Hatha Yoga. So she's writing that up for her monograph. Should be ready in the summer. Mark Singleton has been writing on the kind of the later part of Hatha Yoga and how it transitions into the modern era. And then Jason Birch is looking at the kind of second half of the pre-modern period. I'm looking up to about the 15th century, and then he's looking at the 15th to 18th century. So those are the primary outputs. Yeah.
And actually, speaking of films, I'd really recommend people check out a film that we made with Dr. Mallinson on the British Museum YouTube channel, where he talked about Hatha Yoga's links to Tantra, and also we reenacted some of the postures that are represented in that British Library manuscript. It's a really great film. And actually that leads me to my next question, because you've shown quite a few representations of male yogis performing the various postures, but not women. So, and yet we do see many representations of women as yoginis and gurus. So I'm curious about this. Why is this? Why do we not see women enacting those postures?
Why we don't see them? Well, I mean, I think a possible answer, I can't be completely confident in the answer, is that women weren't doing the postures. Okay, I don't, we it came to me about 6 months or a year ago. I was asked to give a talk on women in Hatha yoga, and it occurred to me that we do actually have no pre-modern evidence of any sort, whether it's sort of travelers' reports, material depictions, textual explanations of women performing yoga postures. What we do have, we have some Mughal miniatures of women doing postures of asceticism, of self-mortification. As I mentioned at the beginning, the kind of ancient, the oldest form of physical practice. So I've seen quite a few Mughal miniatures showing women leaning on swings, which indicate, standing up whilst leaning on a swing, which indicates that they don't sit down at all. We do get references in the text, so in the Hatha Pradipika, for example, to women in the context of yoga practice, but not in the context of asana practice. There's a sort of, and we get even, there's a fun passage in a Marathi text called the Lila Charitra, where there's a yogini called Bahudi, I think it is, and she has a sort of a sexual, she's called a Hatha yogini, in fact, but this is Hatha yoga in the kind of Vajrayana Tantric Buddhist context, of where it's a sort of sexual practice in which you don't let go of your vital energies, and she's said to overcome this male yogi by sucking out his fluids and so forth. So we know that women, there were clearly yoginis, there were women doing yoga practice, but not asana practice, as far as we know. Of course, absence of evidence doesn't necessarily mean evidence of absence, but to my knowledge, there is no evidence of women doing asana practice.
So that sounds like a really interesting future avenue for research. Do you have, is there any sense of why they might have not been enacting the postures and not participating in that part of, that aspect of Hatha yoga practice? Is there a sense of that? I'm thinking, the exhibition explores the fact that earlier Hindu and Buddhist traditions taught that the female body was an impediment to achieving enlightenment. And that women should remain, submissive, dependent on men. That's the sort of rhetoric that we see a lot in earlier Hindu and Buddhist orthodox texts. But Tantra seems to teach that women can achieve rapid spiritual enlightenment because they are natural embodiments of Shakti. So I'm wondering, it's just very curious to me what you're saying, and wondering if you have any insights, or whether this is something that requires future research about why women were perhaps not participating in that aspect of Hatha yoga practice.
Yeah, I think with the textual tradition, one could argue that as I've argued today, and I think this may explain partly, is that the texts are all written kind of within for male monastics. So even if they knew of women doing these postures, they probably wouldn't even wouldn't care to mention them. And then we don't, and perhaps that's the same. Most of our depictions, like illustrated manuscripts, they are illustrations of the texts themselves. And actually, we don't have a huge amount of evidence of pre-modern asana practice when it comes down to it. So, like I say, it's not impossible that women were doing it, but I think also it may be that it wasn't seen as something that women should do. I don't, and you say, is it an avenue for future research? But it would be great to be able to look into it more. But I'm not really sure where one would look. We don't have any sources. We don't have anything to draw upon. Like I say, of course, it's not impossible that women were doing it. Were doing asana practice, but there's no record of it. That's the problem.
And you mentioned Mughal representations of yoginis, and there are hundreds of representations of yogis and yoginis painted in Indian courtly context, but especially, as you say, in that Mughal context. And one of the articles that you wrote, and you've written quite a lot on this, is the first detailed representations of yogis and yoginis occur from around the 16th century and are commissioned by Mughal patrons such as Akbar. But my question is, why do you think the Mughals were so attracted to these figures and their practices?
Well, I think, Indian ascetics since, time of Alexander have had a reputation for, great powers and being able to bestow gifts on people and so forth. So there may be that aspect to it, but also I think there was, great opportunity for crossover between Sufi and yogi traditions. And certainly we see these Arabic and Persian texts, which, they frame yogic practice within Islamic theology, but they incorporate the techniques with, into Sufi practice as well. And certainly, some of the Nath yogis are often, we see Islamic traditions of Nath yogis as well. They seem to be very closely associated in some aspects with Islamic traditions. That generally in the textual and artistic traditions we see that have been patronized by the Mughals, it's the Nath yogis that are being depicted, not exclusively, but primarily. I think for one of the reasons for that is that they've always been less kind of exclusive than the other ascetic traditions in India, yet less kind of caste bound and so forth. And of course, they are fascinating, colourful characters as well. I guess similar reason to why when I started traveling around India and fell in with charismatic, exciting, practitioners of yoga, I wanted to find out more about them, and they're one of the many wonderful aspects of Indian religious culture, and one of the most attractive, I suppose.
That leads me nicely to my final question, actually, because as you say, various sects in India did come to practice Hatha yoga, but as you mentioned, the one most popularly perhaps associated with its development was the Tantric Nath order. And today they're one of the most important sects in South Asia. And as you say, historically, they received patronage from Mughal rulers and exchanged ideas with Sufi mystics, which we see reflected in courtly painting. But today we're seeing a rebranding of Nath identity, aren't we, as an exclusively and aggressively Hindu one that denies any trace of that rich Indo-Islamic context. Why are we seeing such a change now in contrast with the early pluralistic outlook?
Well, I think, there's one central answer to that is the figure that I showed, the picture of Yogi Adityanath, who's the chief minister of Uttar Pradesh and also the Gorakshaput Adhisha, I think he calls himself. So he's the head of the Goraknath monastery in Gorakhpur, and he, of course, is renowned for being a firebrand Hindu nationalist, and so and has been very outspoken, trying to airbrush Mughal history. But as you say, it's rather sad because it is airbrushing. It's getting rid of some of the most fascinating aspects of the Nath's history. In fact, even the Goraknath Mutt, the monastery in Gorakhpur, it seems that the records show that it was a local Nawab, so a Muslim Nawab, I can't remember his name, Asaf-ud-Dawla, I think it is. He gave the land, it was a land grant, but he gave the land for that monastery. And Aurangzeb, who's seen as the kind of bête noire of Hindu nationalists today, he patronized Nath yogis in a place called Jakbar in northern Punjab, and he would get mercury, solidified mercury that was seen to have a sort of magical alchemical powers. He would get that from these yogis. And even within the texts as well, if we look at the vernacular texts of the Nath yogi traditions, we quite often see this refrain of, we're not Hindus, we're not Muslims, we are yogis, we transcend all these religious boundaries and so forth. So yeah, I think if it wasn't for, and it's not just Yogi Adityanath, it's his predecessors, Yogi Avedyanath and so forth. They have continuously sort of bang the drum of Hindu nationalism. So I think it's purely down to them. And I like to think, although perhaps it's wishful thinking, I'm sure it's getting more and more difficult for these Islamic, there are still Islamic yogi traditions in Bihar and UP and so forth, but I think they're finding it harder and harder to maintain that identity. Yeah, so it's I find it's rather sad, because it's one of the most interesting things about their history.
Thank you. So now I'm going to have a look at some of the questions that have come through from our audience. Okay, here is a question from Nina, who asks, can you elaborate on the Chinese influence on Tantra, the inner alchemy? Which Chinese tradition is this related to?
Okay, well, I'm slightly out of my depth here, and I think I've actually just had a email from a Taoist scholar on Taoism in the States, who we've been collaborating a bit, but I think really it needs a sort of full-blown research project with scholars who are specialists in all these areas. I mean, I'm not the first person to point this out. Other scholars have noted the parallels, but I think what we see, so as I said with the Amrita Siddhi, so this first text to teach Hatha Yoga, a key to understanding it, which took me a while to crack, was that it is framed in these alchemical metaphors. Okay, the body is likened to an alchemical crucible, and we find something very similar going on in Chinese. I think I may get it. I'm not sure it's all. I like to say everything's Taoist, but I'm not sure that it is all Taoist. There are distinctions between the traditions in China. But there's one that's known as Nedan, I think, and that's inner alchemy. Okay, with very similar principles going on with the sun and the moon and so forth, and holding the breath. And the texts on Nedan, they appear about 200 or 300 years before the Indian Hatha Yoga texts. And then again, there are strong parallels between the external alchemy traditions. So yes, these principles seem to match up quite closely. But as I said, at the same time, I don't know where the practices themselves come from. I don't see, from my kind of rudimentary readings in translations of Chinese texts, parallels with the techniques of Hatha Yoga, so the physical methods of, dropping yourself down onto the base of the central channel to send the breath up the central column, and the postures and so forth. We don't see close parallels there, but I think it's within the and I'm writing this up, and I've written it up, and for publication should be coming out in the edition of the Amrita Siddhi. It's the parallels between the principles governing the Hatha yogic body are too close to be coincidental. So I'm pretty sure there's definitely something going on there. But as I said, I think it needs another large research project to get to the bottom of it.
Fantastic. Okay, and Anushka asks, could you elaborate on the postures that have been found in Indus Valley civilization imagery?
No, in a short answer, because I mean, we see this one posture, don't we, that's sometimes likened. Various scholars have said, and I think going back to Marshall, wasn't it, straight away, sort of identified it as a yogic posture, and people jump on this and say, well, that's evidence for yoga being 5,000 years old. But firstly, and I haven't looked that closely into this, but I just, we see there's no other evidence for yoga practice for another at least 2,000 years. And there's no evidence for these postural physical practice like that, for postures such as that one, for about another 3,000 years. Okay, so to posit continuity, I think, is too much of a jump, not least because we find similar depictions of postures all over the world, from South America to Europe in ancient traditions. So again, it's a bit like when I was talking about with women practicing asanas in pre-modern India. It's not impossible, but to say that confidently that they were, or that the seals from the Indus Valley depict yoga practice, I think is going way beyond what the evidence allows.
Thank you, Dr. Mallinson. And okay, we've got a couple more questions here. So Barbara asks, can the lack of written literature of asanas be related to the fact that ancient teachings or exclusively passed from the mouth of a master to the ear of a low number of selected students?
Yeah, it's a good question. Well, something I often get asked. I suspect that the context of the question is suggesting that what I've identified as innovations 1,000 years ago might be older, and that's, again, I did think that until I worked on this project, but now what I realize is, so if we look at the comparison with the ascetic practices, so the practices of self-mortification, where holding arms up in the air for years on end or standing up on one leg and so forth, those we do see and we do hear about in texts, okay, passing allusions in texts, okay, but we see quite a lot of material images of them, but we have absolutely nothing suggesting any of these balancing postures or headstands or the Mayurasana and so forth. So I think, faced with that total absence of evidence, whereas similar situation, you have to go back to the ascetic techniques, the techniques of standing up for years on end, holding arms up in the air for years on end. Those are not written down in text ever, okay? They are passed down orally. We know that to this day. We know that they were being practiced at least 2.5, maybe 3,000 years ago, and they're still being practiced to this day. But there's no handbook, there's no Sanskrit text, or there's no Hindi text saying how to prepare yourself for holding your arm up in the air for the rest of your life. So with that parallel, why to me, again, the evidence is, I just do think that these balancing complex yoga postures just appear from nowhere about 1,000 years ago. Because if we look at, if we compare the two notions, why should one have some earlier evidence and the other none at all, when both are up to that, if both up to that point have been transmitted only orally.
Ananda asks, I was told that yoga practices were only written when the school had no students left, and unless written down, practices would be lost. Wouldn't that give us an incorrect impression of their dates if we're only looking at written evidence?
Well, we've got to remember that the written evidence itself, the manuscripts are not very old anyway, apart from that Amrita Siddhi manuscript, which may be 12th century, and even that might not be the case. It's got a date of 1160 at the end of it, but the date might have been copied by a scribe. Other than that, the oldest manuscript I work with on these Hatha Yoga texts is late 15th century. So we're only, we're only inferring the dates from other evidence. But again, so the question was what, I think the implication of the question, the purport of the question was maybe the texts are only written down late on after the practice might die out because there were no practitioners. Conceivably, but there are lots, there are texts on yoga going back, we get a steady flow of texts on yoga from about 2,000 years ago, okay? And they do talk about asanas all the way through, and we can date those texts. We've got Patanjali, nowadays is dated to about 400. There's the Buddhist Yogacara Bhumi. There are other Buddhist texts detailing the practices of ascetics, including physical methods, the Lalita Vistara, for example, or other texts going to the early part of the first millennium. Lots of Puranas have teachings on yoga, dating back to the 5th or 6th century. Lots of Tantras have teachings on yoga. They all cover asana, but none of them mention any asanas apart from seated postures for meditation. So I still don't think, I don't agree with the premise of the question that you only write things down when they're about to die out. I think, and also I don't think the fact, I think the fact that we have so many yoga texts detailing asanas over the first millennium in which we find no teachings on complex asana practice, I think that's strong evidence that they weren't being done. And of course also no material evidence either, whereas we do have plenty of material evidence of seated postures for meditation and so forth.
Okay, great. And there's lots of interest amongst the audience to find more evidence of women, female practitioners of yoga. Lysite says, I thought that there were women depicted in the statuary at the gates we were shown. Is the issue that there is no written account of their involvement?
so I'm not sure about the question. Is it what, no written account of the involvement of yoginis in the, are we talking about the Dubois Gate there, that statuary? Or?
I think it's the gate that you found in Gujarat that
Yeah.
represents the. Oh, in fact, I think she's referring to the yogini goddesses, isn't she?
Ah,
Perhaps.
yeah. Okay. Yes. Well, that's a different thing. So yes, that's a, you have to have a good look in the in Dr. Ramos's catalogue, because that explains what the complications in the term yogini, because it doesn't necessarily refer to a human female practitioner of yoga, and they're not. I mean, they're not depicted in you know, what we would understand as yoga postures now either. But yeah, yoginis. Yeah, I'm not saying there weren't women practitioners of yoga. There would certainly, there definitely were, you know, and there's definitely female practitioners of tantric yoga and yoga to core. But what my specific point is that there's no evidence for female practitioners of complex yoga postures, you know, balancing postures and so forth.
That's fantastic. Well, there's just one. Someone would like to know the name of the film that you mentioned, the one that you're working on, so that people can keep an eye out for it. Do you know what the name will be yet, or
Okay.
how people?
Well, what is the name? Because it's two of my colleagues are working on it, but the text is called the Hatha Bhyasa Paddhati. It's a bit of a mouthful. It just means a sort of manual of Hatha practice. If you look on, I'll tell you where you might get some good information. My colleagues have a blog and a website called The Luminescent. Okay, so it's Jason Birch and Jacqueline Hargreaves, and they're working on that in particular. It's great. There's of the 112 postures, there's only they ran out of people in the UK who could do them, and then they found this wonderful school in Maharashtra where the children practice yoga, and they managed to get almost all of them done there. There's just one remaining now that seems to be absolutely physically impossible. So I'm not sure what they're going to do with that in the film. Maybe a bit of CGI or something.
That's fantastic. Okay, well, thank you so much to Dr. Mallinson. Please join me in thanking him for his excellent presentation today and for that Q&A. And thank you everyone so much for coming. And so I think that's it. I think we'll wrap up now, and I hope everyone has a lovely evening. Thank you, Dr. Mallinson, again. Goodbye, everyone.